to do with Symposium's conception and planning. We need to acknowledge, I'm glad that you pressed record precisely at this moment, Nicole. We need to acknowledge the extraordinary labor of organizational love this has involved. Firstly, the fabulous Nicole Callahan from NYU's EWP, who first conceived of this idea, then partnered with Marion Wren of NYU Abu Dhabi and Dara Gagnon from NYU's Department of English and the then director of EWP. Nicole and Marion put together a committee who have worked so hard, and I want to acknowledge Jeannie M., Natalia Andrzejewski, Natasha Zaretsky, Gita Bender, Suzanne Cope, Mark Brayley, Elizabeth Fay, Kimberly Bernhardt, Tanya Friedel, Sarah Wallace, and Joseph Califf, as well as Nate Mickelson for providing additional guidance. I'd like to also thank all of the speakers, panelists, and moderators, and to welcome our colleagues from CUNY, Stony Brook, Northwestern, Napa Valley College, Portland State, Rutgers, Penn State, the New School, Barnard, Mount Sinai Academy of Medicine, St. John's, Manhattanville College, and Berkeley. I'd like to thank Suresh Kanagaraja for giving us a tragedy in 4 acts for his keynote address. And finally, I'd like to give a special shout out to our student ambassadors from NYU, Taylor Bland, Carla Bueno, Alex Chapman, Daralee De La Cruz, Alex Harper, Dayon Lee, Ryan Lee, and Daniela Sandoval. We welcome their voices. After all, it is our students who bring us to this work, and our experience with them is the bedrock on which much of the next 2 days sits. A few housekeeping notes. As noted on the registration page, and as you just heard, this event is being recorded. With the exception of the keynote address, where you can send questions to the host, we encourage you to pass notes to each other during class, as it were. That is, to use the chat function in Zoom to reach out to each other. To facilitate this, you might want to amend your name by clicking the 3 dots that appear in the upper right corner of your image to add your place, university affiliation, and/or preferred pronouns. We're all old hands at Zoom by now, but given that we have a lot of people here, we'd also request that we keep ourselves muted when not talking to minimize background noise. We also have closed captioning for this event too, which can be accessed through the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any technical questions about Zoom, please send a message to Nicole Callahan through the chat function here. So without further ado, I'd like to pass the baton to Gita Bender, who will be moderating Suresh Kanagaraja's keynote address. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, and welcome everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us for Revision and Reform Teaching Writing Across Borders. It is my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Suresh Kanagaraja. When we began planning this symposium almost 2 years ago, we imagined 2020 as a kairotic moment to go in search of clarity and insight into the very real and symbolic acts of border crossing we engage in every day in our classes. We also knew then that there was no one better than Suresh, a preeminent scholar in the field of language, literacy, and migration, to frame the conversation for us. A few words about Suresh. He's the Edwin Earl Sparks Professor of Applied Linguistics, English, and Asian Studies at Penn State University, where he teaches World Englishes, second language writing, and post-colonial. His early education and teaching took place in the war-torn region of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. Education and teaching took place in the war-torn region of Jaffna in Sri Lanka. His 1999 book, Resisting Linguistic Imperialism in English Teaching, won MLA's Mina Shaughnessy Award for the best research publication on the teaching of language and literacy. His subsequent publication, Geopolitics of Academic Writing, published in 2002, won the Gary Olson Award for the best book in social and rhetorical theory. His study of World Englishes in Writing Pedagogy won the 2007 Braddock Award for the best article in the College Composition and Communication Journal. One of his recent publications, Translingual Practice, Global Englishes and Cosmopolitan Relations, published by Routledge in 2013, won the 2014 BAAL Best Book Award, 2015 MLA's Mina Shaughnessy Award, and the 2016 AAAL Best Book Award. Finally, his edited collection, The Routledge Handbook of Language and Migration, won the 2020 AAA Award for the best book in the field. And now it is with great pleasure that I present to you Suresh Kanagaraja. Welcome, Suresh.
I'm unmuting myself now that I can speak. Thank you, Geeta, for the flattering introduction. When JF said, there's something wrong in your introduction, I thought he was going to say, no, he doesn't teach in Penn State. He teaches somewhere in a crazy remote country, somewhere like Sri Lanka. And I'm glad it happened while you were speaking because you handle things better. Anyway, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me. Let me see if I can share my screen. You guys see it? Got it? Okay, perfect. Okay, so when people have been referring to the changes in our times, all three talks so far, including JF's plenary, but. I think there's been a change in the theme from when it was when the conference was organized more than a year ago. I think the organizers presented revision and reform in terms of writing, like revising multiple drafts. And the new drafts give a new form for the essay. The new form creates a new vision for your argument, etc. But after the pandemic and struggle for social justice, racial structural reform, I thought in some of the recent notifications, the theme was redefined. Reform as in police reform, reform as in structural reform. And in order to do that kind of reform, you need a new social vision. And the structural reform can also generate a new vision for all of us. So I think both themes are excellent, and I want to kind of touch on both of them in this talk. But to start with the second one first, some recent publications like White Fragility and How to Be an Anti-Racist, they all make us start with our attitudes, dispositions, while we also focus on structural reform. A lot of people have criticized that kind of focus on ourselves and our feelings and attitudes and biases. But I think that's a good place to start. And in this talk, I'm going to talk about how we teachers, while we teach across borders, might also examine our hidden biases. Let's start with us. To go to the first theme of reform, revision in communication, I'm going to try a different form for this talk. I'm going to turn this into a narrative or even a play. I know that people don't have a lot of patience for narratives in a keynote talk. I'm told they come ready for bullet points of impressive theories and citations and data, etc. And no, people don't have patience for a story. So I want to allay your fears by saying this is actually from a research, from an IRB approved research. It's a classroom ethnography. I've presented it elsewhere in an academic journal, but I am changing it into a narrative because it generates a different vision for me as a teacher and probably for you as teachers. So it does derive from research. I'm not fooling around. And for those who like bullet points, at the very end, I will highlight the themes and I will have citations, but you have to kind of wait for the story. So let's start with the story. And this drama is about a Japanese student. Let's call her Kyoko. She did some courses for bachelor's degree in Japan and did English writing there. And she's here in the US in a course titled Teaching Second Language Writing, preparing herself to be a teacher. And you have to read her story from the point of view that she always wanted to return to Japan. She called herself an EFL teacher, English as a foreign language teacher, and wanted to get back to Japan. There are a lot of people in this class, but I just want to focus on her relationship with her instructor. So the instructor is an Asian professor in applied linguistics. And because he is himself multilingual and multicultural, he thought he can help the student really well. Both are Asians. He has himself done second language writing. So he understands the challenges for students like this. Besides, he was a critical practitioner. He's progressive. He has read all the Marxist and postmodern and post-structuralist scholars on writing. So he thought, you know, I have this under control. I know exactly what to do to help students become more agentive and resistant in their writing. Besides, he has been teaching for 30 years. So he had worked out his pedagogy really well. But you all know in classical tragedy, what brings the hero down is a tragic flaw. And the tragic flaw in this case is hubris, is thinking that you know everything and you can help students effectively because you're so progressive. But the only saving grace with this character is that he had another side of his personality. Is an older, wiser self, which was always nudging him to think differently and look at this classroom differently. So when I look at his journals and logbooks, I see some internal conflict going on. So he's a thorn character. He's a very, very complicated guy. He's a weird guy who talks to himself. So keep track of these two conversations that go on with this character. So the tragedy, well, before I go into the story, let me also introduce the setting, the course, that how this course was set up. And this professor believed in practice-based learning. So in order to learn how to teach writing, he said the students in his course have to do writing, you know, learn about writing by writing. So one of the main activities in this course was a literacy narrative. So the students were writing about how they became literate throughout the semester, multiple drafts, revision, reform, and a lot of feedback from the teacher and the other from the peers. He designed the course as dialogical, meaning he didn't want to do teacher-led lectures, but focus a lot on interactions. So he used the web-based platform as a supplementary site where students posted their drafts, had conversations with each other, giving feedback, and the teacher feedback was also there. So it was dialogical. And thirdly, he believes in an ecological orientation to learning, making use of all the resources in the classroom rather than just the textbook or the syllabus. So he expected students to learn from each other through their own literacy narratives, you know, that their peers were writing. They had a journal where they were periodically commenting on how they were progressing with their writing. They were writing about their reference readings, and everybody was learning from all these texts in the classroom, and he thought, you know, that's a good thing. So the conflict in this story started developing in the very beginning. In the first week, he asked all the students, both native speaker American students and international students, to introduce themselves on the web with a short paragraph. And what Kyoko did was something like this. She said, I'm in the middle of taking in North American academic discourse, and I've been struggling with how I express myself in L2 writing. I feel like being in the middle of nowhere when I write in English. This phrase, middle of nowhere, she would use very often in other journals and even in her first draft. Plus, the word struggle was also coming up very often. So that was very striking to the professor, because he knew that, you know how American students introduce themselves, right? You know, I've done great writing, I've won awards, and I'm going to be the best teacher. They put their best foot forward, whereas this student was just talking about struggle and confusion. So, but this kept on coming. In the second draft of a literacy narrative, Kyoko started the essay with this and moved on to another paragraph where she talked about her high school writing. Once again, she said, writing always associates with pain and embarrassment. I have had excessive self-consciousness since I was born. And then she goes on to say, with the first writing assignment she got in high school, I knew I had no creativity in writing, and I was not brave to venture to disclose my shame. So once again, he was struck by how she was very diffident. For the professor, it looked like she lacked agency and individuality and voice. So immediately his thoughts went to the field of contrastive rhetoric. A lot of his colleagues had written publications like this, where they had said Asian students have difficulty with critical thinking, and they have challenges in being more individualistic and asserting themselves and representing their voice. He would have thought this is stereotyping, but then he remembered even Japanese scholars had said something like that. In Japan, they had compared Japanese writing, academic writing, with English writing, and said their Japanese writing in English is stilted English. So he thought, this seems to be a problem here. But notice this, there are some really senior, famous teachers, when they see a problem or a writing challenge, they think in citations. I don't know if you do that, but really, really advanced scholars. So when he sees a student, his mind immediately goes to some publications. So that might be a problem. Let's keep that in mind. And then when there was an opportunity in the web-based learning site for peer review, in this class, they all shared their essays and provided feedback. So for Kyoko, he wrote these questions to facilitate the classroom discussion. He said, he pointed the paragraphs I showed you earlier and said, do you see this passive and differential tone throughout the essay? And then what can we do to make Kyoko develop a more critical voice? For example, when she talks about being very detached and lethargic in the classroom, is she maybe critiquing the pedagogy rather than just making her look bad? So he was trying to develop some critical kind of tone in the essay. But he was surprised that other students didn't see the essay that way. This is an Anglo-American student. She responded, Chrissy, that, I see a lot of other identities in her essay. Because Kyoko does say in one of her anecdotes that her older brother and youngest brother, because they were males, they were given preferential treatment, and she was very upset by that kind of treatment. So Chrissy said, there are notes of criticality and individuality in some sections of the essay. Another student, Tim, who is also Anglo-American, he said, being critical is not easy. Depends on power differences, depends on who the teacher is. So he could understand why Kyoko positions herself differently. So Kyoko triangulated all this, the conversation where the teacher seems to think she is different and other students who understand her. She engaged in a thought process on what does critical mean for her. And this is a journal after that. And she says, I think the way Americans think about criticality is different from how we Japanese think about criticality. And if you look at the third line, she says, of course, we approach one thing from diverse perspectives in our own way. So I think she presents her kind of criticality as triangulating multiple perspectives and forming a position. But it's not the same way like an aggressive, individualistic stance that Americans might prefer. Now, the professor is, of course, he's vain. He felt stung. He thought maybe is she criticizing me for the type of attitude I am adopting towards critical thinking. But Kyoko continued her exploration, and then by her own initiative, she read another literacy narrative. This is by the famous contrastive rhetoric scholar Ulla Connor. You might have heard of her. And in her literacy narrative, she talks about how she came from Finland. She was also demure and passive when she came, but she transitioned to academic discourse. I think almost in a funny way, she concludes by saying, I transitioned so much that I became an American. I decided to get American citizenship. But Kyoko says, she understands this transition differently. She rejected her L1 background, has acquired a new identity as an American through her life in the US. I am not her. Now, neither do I want to deny my history nor become a mini American. So it looks like she was looking for a different position in between these two discourses. This is where the older, wiser self of the prof kicked in. And he said, maybe critical pedagogy has to be understood differently. It may not be the same thing for all people. So, and it relates to different people's cultures, and criticality might be different and represented differently according to different cultural norms. But he wasn't listening to his older, wiser self at that point. And then a second conflict started brewing. It's the fact that Kyoko was very expressive in her writing. And the prof, although he knows that academic writing is also hybrid and can have a place for affect, he thought it has less room for affect. It shouldn't be too expressive, too feelingful. So look at a paragraph she wrote in her third draft. This is a vignette about writing in a high school in Japan. And she was stuck for a theme. And then she finally thought about a theme, which was saying goodbye to her old car and buying a new car. And what was a very sad event it was for her. But it was kind of, she said, suddenly I got an inspiration in the middle of the night and started writing. And it's very poetic. If you look at the lines I highlighted, once I got started to write, my deep and a long attention span assisted me to drive a pencil. Noise around me got muted, light around me got dark, and time flow stopped. I wrote and wrote as my heart tells. So look at the personification. Attention drove my pencil. Heart told me to write. And then look at the parallelism. Noise around me got muted, light around me got dark, time flow stopped. But he was happy with that. But then she went on at the conclusion of that paragraph to say, when I finished writing, my eyes were full of tears. She was actually weeping. So I thought, that's a little too much. Actually, she went on to say, when her Japanese professors read this essay, they were weeping too. And they congratulated on this great writing. So he, in his teacher feedback, the professor for this draft said, I'm really stuck by how much such a high place you're given to feelings. It's okay to have emotions in your writing, but I guess he was trying to say, try to prepare the reader for it by explaining why, how you see feelings in academic writing, how much you see as relevant. And then he concluded with a kind of a sarcastic note about the Japanese teachers. I cried a lot too when I read some sections of your narrative. So, he didn't realize how it might be culturally insensitive. He did include a apostrophe to mention that he was being sarcastic, and he knew that he was being playful. But that probably would tell something to Kyoko. But at the same time, other students were much more receptive to her feelings. Look, this is an Anglo-American student, Sissy. She says, I see a very poetic writing in your literacy autobiography. There's an emotional memory. I wish that's something I could be more like. So here's an Anglo-American student who likes that kind of effect. And then Mark, another American student, said, the identity you write about in the start of the paper seems very different from the person who wrote such an interesting and personal story. He thought she had set up deliberately her opening in terms of being diffident and passive because she wanted to surprise the reader. It's because she had a lot of feelings. So in his logbook, the prof wrote something like this. He was really stung. He thought the whole class is banding against him because they are reading this essay differently. I don't think he uses the word morons for students. I know he'll get fired from the university, but these are things probably he wrote in his logbook, which I saw that, is his personal thoughts. So Kyoko gained from all this discussion. She triangulated them. And in her next draft, her fourth draft, she tried to engage more with reference reading to make her literacy biography a little more objective, with citations to back up some of her ideas. So here's a journal where she gives game plan. She said, I'm trying to become more focused. I'm going to narrow down my theme, and I'm reading a lot of academic resources that are helping me. So look at her subsequent revision. The same paragraph, everything is there, but the final 2 lines are missing. That is how she cried at the end of the writing. So, so she has reduced the expression of feelings and sentimentality to some degree, but not completely, because she still has the parallelism and personification, almost poetic kind of writing. So she's kind of taking things in her own pace, in her own way, not giving completely in to the professor. And I guess this is the value of having a more dialogical kind of class, where the students are also commenting and providing conflicting feedback to, in their case, to affirm Kyoko. So look at a paragraph that came after that, where writing is a little more objective. She gives a lot of citations here to explain the Japanese education. Remember, Prof had tried to laugh at the Japanese teachers by saying, I'm also crying like them when I read your essays. So she says, this is how Japanese education works. So initially he was really happy that there are all these citations, she's doing reference reading and including them in her revisions. But then his older, wiser self said, if you read the writing carefully, she's actually making a case for affect in Japanese education. So she's saying, since an elementary school classroom teacher addresses students' whole personality, it builds an intimate teacher-student relationship. So it looks like, here again, she's criticizing his approach, but in a very muted, in a soft way. So, but then the prof, this is just a quiet voice that he didn't take too seriously, that maybe this is a possibility. But at this point, the prof thought the student is being very innocent and naive and not capable of sarcasm, subtle resistance, and fighting back, speaking back. So because one of the things that he saw was she was also saying, it is difficult to be critical to analyze my own writing. I'm finding it difficult to adopt a more reflective position in my own writing. I can tell the story, but I'm also struggling to analyze my own story. So immediately the seasoned professor's mind went to the next problem he has to tackle. He says, just telling a straightforward linear narrative is easy, but analyzing your own narrative to develop a theme, a thesis is difficult. But look at his language. Time to attack this problem now. I guess, Tom, some teachers think about writing challenges and options as a problem, and they are so, this is a militaristic metaphor, attack the problem. So he's kind of, that seems to be his approach to teaching writing, to identify problems and tackle them. So in his teacher feedback, he said something like this: you can do more to highlight your theme and thesis better at this point, because we're coming to the end of the semester. It's December already. So what theme are you trying to bring out? Can you work a little more on an intro and a conclusion? So far, it has been a linear narrative. So if you have an introduction with a thesis statement or something, that'll give you better control over what you're saying. But I think what he overlooked was she already had considerable reflexivity. Her writing was considerably layered. It was ironic. There was a lot of sarcasm, but he didn't know how to interpret that. He didn't expect that. So look at a paragraph very later. This is a 6th draft, and it's one of the paragraphs where she says, I learned the writing rules of particular school of thought in applied linguistics. It was quite smooth to write a research paper. This is about writing a research paper in Japan. Since all I had to do was imitate their writing styles. Research design and implement process made me realize how to make up the findings and make them sound objective. I gained some peculiar word usage in the field from reading articles, and I made repeated use of these words as children do when they learn a new vocabulary. So looks like she's saying I engaged in very mechanical, formulaic writing, and because I thought, research writing has a formula, just follow the formula and sprinkle it with some academic jargon, and you'll get a good grade. So once again, the prof's mind went to what he has read in Contrastive Rhetoric about Asians as plagiarizing essays. Of course, this is again something that he didn't talk out aloud, but said to himself, maybe she's just saying, you know, I just did passive writing and borrowed just text from elsewhere and made up a good essay. But then his older, wiser self said, actually, if you read it carefully, it looks like she's actually laughing at her teachers who are not giving her good feedback. If you read the paragraph further down, she says, my thesis advisor checked my draft a couple of times, and every time she said nothing but, you are doing well, you're doing well. The final draft was edited by the Mac enthusiast. This is an American teacher teaching in Japan. She gives him a nickname because he loves computers and editing. Native English speaking teacher. It was predictable that he corrected my all grammatical mistakes in detail. Of course, my findings were not one of the major findings in the 21st century. And of course, nobody knows my MA thesis is well done. Here, it looks like she's laughing at her teachers who are not commenting on her ideas, but either giving her perfunctory feedback or in other cases, just editing for grammar mistakes. So there seems to be some reflexivity, sarcasm. You know, she's actually laughing at herself in the end, rather than being naive. She says, well, I just follow the rules, and this is not a big essay, you know, and it's not the greatest finding in the world that I produced from my essay. So she has the capacity to laugh at herself. So let's come to the final draft that she submitted. And this is just the introduction and the conclusion that the prof wanted. So she has a title now. So she's a lot more focused. She seems to focus on a particular theme. The first paragraph presents the conflict. Japanese is a part of myself. English, especially academic writing, is detached from myself. So she talks about how she is caught between these two languages and feels alienated by English. But she doesn't talk there in the first paragraph how she resolved this conflict. In the final paragraph, she actually says a little more about English was more detached and still alien to me. And then she says, I don't know how long it will take for me to master it. So for the prof, it looked like she hasn't positioned herself in these languages and discourses effectively. And then to make matters worse, his eyes were glazing around the grammar mistakes. So look at just one of the lines. Entrance to English as a foreign language introduced me the forms of a new language. So she probably meant introduction to English as a foreign language, introduced me to the forms of a new language. So he thought she hasn't edited her essays well. All the students were asked to go to the tutoring center, get help to get a nice final draft, final product that's well edited. So he was a little disappointed. He thought, first of all, she's still lost and passive. All the way in the beginning of the semester, she said she's in the middle of nowhere, and that tone's still there. And then she didn't make an effort to edit the essay. So he thought, maybe an average grade should be fine. But then his older, wiser self thought, I think there's something more going on in this essay, because if you read closely a few other lines in the same text that I showed you, close encounter of the alien. Who is the alien? English could be alien, but she could also be laughing at herself as the alien. I'm the outsider in English, and she's creatively borrowing something from manga novels and Japanese horror movies to creatively introduce a twist to her final essay. And then though she presents a conflict between Japanese and English, she provides very good reasons why they are conflicting. One is Japanese Elman writing is emotional. It is addressed to my emotional, mental, cognitive, social, and intellectual growth as a whole person. She learned all the genres, and especially creative and personal genres in Japanese. But ESL discourse is limited in academic discourse, which mainly address to intellectual competence. That is, I'm learning English only for functional purposes. So I'm not engaged in that. So in the concluding paragraph, she says things like, English has never had a feeling provoking occasion yet for me. It doesn't really appeal to me personally. So there's a good reason why she is caught between these two discourses. But also look at some of the other lines. While earlier her prose was very emotional, affective, here it's also getting a little tighter, with more objective. Look at phrases like my literacy development process, socialization process via language, whole personality development. It failed to offer me context to internalize its language process. It looks like her reference readings have helped her to make her writing a lot more tighter and more objective. And also look at the conclusion. She's not lost. She's saying, I'm in the middle of the shifting process of thinking in English from personal to objective or from emotional to logical. So she always said middle of nowhere earlier. Now she's saying middle of the shifting process. So is there development? Of course, you know, she's presenting herself as making some progress, and she has identified clearly the direction she needs to go. So that is progress. The professor didn't give this kind of reading, this more self-aware, positive reading too much value, because he thought, look at her grammar problems. I don't think she has capability of expressing irony, sarcasm in English yet, because she's still trying to develop control over her language. But so he didn't give it too much importance. But one thing good about this professor is he collected all the students' drafts and their journals and saved all their activities to look at them at the end of the semester. So after he had turned in the grades in summer, about 6 months later, he was looking at all the writings that the students did, and he found Kyoko probably knew what she wanted from this course and was engaged in her own trajectory of development that was different from the teacher's understanding of how this development should take place. So one of the things he found later, 6 months later, when he was reading all the things she wrote, is I've been struggling with how I position myself in L2 context. After coming to an ESL setting, I realized how my own literacy background is blessed in my own way. I'm not taking over the L2 discourse, but I'd rather take advantage of this difference as an ESL speaker. What she's saying is, I'm happy with all the things I learned in Japan, the type of literacy I developed in Japan. I'm not interested in transitioning completely to English. I'm looking for the position, the word she uses is how I position myself. So she's looking for a middle position between these discourses rather than transitioning completely to academic English academic discourses. Here's another thing she said at the very end of the semester, when the prof wanted everybody to write a kind of a self-assessment for their portfolio. And she said, I realized that knowing the rule is the first level of the game. If you want to win the game, you have to take an ownership of it. I think I was more submissive about learning and teaching academic writing. From this course, I learned the possibility of teaching writing to make learners more aware of negotiation. So she has a different plan, a game plan for her course, that is learn the rules of the game, how academic writing works, not because you want to emulate it or adopt it uncritically, but take ownership of it, that is appropriate it in your own way. So that made the prof think now maybe she had a different agenda for this course that he misunderstood. And he was struck by her words, I'm blessed in my own way. I don't want to change too much. I want to change on my terms. And that's when his older, wiser self won out this internal conflict. And those of you who are looking for bullet points, for themes, here there are 3 themes of this drama. One is he found that criticality might find different realization in different ways for students from different cultures. Even silence can be critical and resistant. Even passivity can be critical and resistant. Not everybody has to be agentive, expressive, individualistic. Secondly, he realized now he is he likes things, he accepts that textual hybridity is an option. And not everybody has to transition completely to one norm, or students can position themselves translingually between 2 or 3 languages and adopt a middle position. But the problem is hybridity is not an answer to a problem. It's the problem that needs to be negotiated. That is, what extent of feelings and expressivity are permitted in academic writing varies. For some teachers, especially for this prof, he wanted the essay to come closer to the academic norms, even when somebody had expressive resources. But for some students, that might not be a favorable alternative. They want the hybridity to be closer to their culture, so it can be much more divergent, the final product, from academic norms. Thirdly, the mistake the prof made was to look at grammar as indicative of somebody's thinking and discourse. And that clouded his judgment. There was actually a lot of subtlety, irony, subtle resistance in the student, but because he was so focused on the grammar problems, and Kyoko didn't make any effort to edit things carefully, because probably she was also focused on the ideas in her essay, his judgment was clouded, and he realized, that shouldn't be the only criterion for judging essays. So now we know, all of you know, there are a lot of teachers who have warned us about that, for teachers coming with their own agendas and making judgments about students according to their disposition. So this is a wonderful essay by Ruth Spack. And she also talks about a longitudinal study. It was many years. She was following one student, also a Japanese student. And what she said is she tried to prepare her for scientific writing, because in her first year for the student, because she thought she's going to go into the sciences. Voila, in about 3 semesters, this student became a literature major in English. And she found, oh, I misjudged this student. Her needs were different. So she wants teachers should be careful not to create curricula on unexamined assumptions about what students will need to succeed. We cannot safely predict what texts and activities will be most beneficial for our students' development. And then similar warning has come from people, scholars involved in cross-cultural understanding. So this is a wonderful writer, scholar I like, Krista Radcliffe, and a book, Rhetorical Listening in Composition Studies, talks about how cross-cultural understanding is something negotiated over time. It's not a one-shot deal. So it will involve a lot of humility, self-criticism, revision of assumptions and understandings. So it should be ongoing. So I think the prof should have been a lot more open to changing his own understanding, estimation of the student, which he didn't do. Finally, even teacher development is ongoing. It's not a one-shot deal. And I think what the prof did, his mistake, was thinking, I've been teaching for 30 years. I'm a progressive teacher. I'm a critical practitioner. And therefore, I have everything under control. But a lot of scholars in teacher education would say, even your engagement with the student every time contributes to making you a different teacher. You're not done changing. Okay, since it's the end of the story, I can reveal, make the big reveal. Probably you guessed it, I am the teacher. And this is my student. And I'm still, this event interaction about 6 years ago has always stuck in my memory because of everything that went wrong. And let me explain why I turned this into a narrative for this presentation. So this is Gary Buckhuizen and his co-authors. He's one of the leading scholars in applied linguistics on narrative inquiry. And he says one of the values of narratives is to present knowledge in embodied form. And I have written this research report in the Journal of Second Language Writing, but I was so focused on Kyoko that I didn't really look at myself. So it wasn't an embodied writing. It was typical academic writing. I was just responding to the reviewers, so focused on analyzing things, the data. But they were all, I realized there were subtle tensions here that I need to bring out at some point. And this narrative gave me an opportunity to talk about me. And then The other thing Bakhuizen says is narratives present fully contextualized experience. So the essay I wrote for Journal of Second Language Writing was on voice. So I was filtering out a lot of things as just noise, rubbish, and just focusing on data that related to voice. But in a narrative, everything is out there. The journals, what other students said, my logbooks. So keeping everything, I think, provides a fuller understanding of what went on. Then a lot of teacher educators, including my colleagues, Karen Johnson, who is my next office, and Paula Golombek, who used to be with us, now she's in Florida, they actually use narratives for teacher development. So they come from a Vygotskian school of thought that tools help us through our engagement and activities to develop more reflexive understandings of our craft, and they use narratives. They get teachers to write their stories. And so in this case, again, you can see changing this whole interaction into a story, preparing the PowerPoint with these call out buttons and images, gave me time to reflect about myself. It gave me time to look at the limitations of my approach. And they also talk about how teacher identity is still developing as you write stories. So actually, even in their courses, not writing courses, just teacher development courses, they get people to write their stories because they feel that writing your story about classrooms, students, helps you develop a different identity as a teacher, a strong identity as a teacher. So I hope this experience is changing me. I can't say has changed me because change doesn't stop to become a better teacher. But there is a final act, and I'll finish with this that I kept for the last. That is about 3 weeks after that end of the semester in fall, in December, after the grades had been turned in, our department has a party, an outdoor party. If the weather is fine, we're out in the lawn of some professor's house. And I was still a little uncomfortable with the grade I gave to Kyoko, because she was still, I thought there was something going on. She's very sarcastic at some points. So did I do the right thing? So I managed to attract Kyoko away from her student, her friends, and try to explain why I had given a not so perfect grade. So I said, now, if only you had edited your essay well. Look, all the other students went to the writing center and they provided a nice draft. Your grade would have been higher. So, but you know what Kyoko did? She just shrugged her shoulders, smiled, and went back to her friends. So that's very hurtful for me. It leaves me with no sense of closure. It makes me wondering, other students would beg for a grade change. They did. I'm a tough grader. And then others would give excuses. I couldn't go to the tutoring center because blah, blah, blah. She didn't say anything. So I'm wondering, did she know she was so confident about herself and what she did that she didn't have to plead for a grade? Or on the other hand, was she so wounded and hurt about how this grade might affect her? Because now she's going back to Japan to teach. What would this not so perfect grade mean for her? So it leaves me thinking a lot, and also just realizing that teaching is a gift. We get to work closely with all our students, shape their discourses, shape their voices, develop agentive, resistant dispositions. But it's also a responsibility. And as Lisa Delpit reminds us here, you're messing around with other people's children. Be careful. So I wonder what I could have done differently to help her facilitate her development in her own way, and try to match my agenda for the course with Kyoko's own agenda for what kind of teacher, writer she wanted to be in Japan. But I call this a tragedy because all of us are forced to grade our students. However tolerant we are, however patient we are, however critical we are, at the end of the semester, it's a B+ or an A- or an A. I don't really give Fs. I'm a good teacher. I love my students. But still, you're judging your student with a grade. And the only thing I can do is become more accommodating of students' interests, a lot more cautious in making judgments about writing, but we should eventually think about the assessment culture we have all over the world, that we have to grade students, and what we can do to develop pedagogical practices that are more self-critical, affirming of diverse discourses, and progress better towards cross-border teaching. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Suresh. That was wonderful. And we apologize for the Zoom bombing, and thank you for so gracefully transitioning into your dog.
Was there a bombing while I was speaking?
No, not while you were speaking.
Perfect, thank you, thank you, thank you.
But it was unnerving for all of us.
Yeah.
So we have lots of wonderful questions from our attendees. I'm going to start out with a couple of questions that that seem related. One question is from Irene Clark, and her question is about the assignment itself, the narrative, the literacy narrative. And the question is if there were any specific expectations for the essay to adhere to a particular structure. So I guess she's asking about the assignment itself.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So one of the reasons I have the literacy narrative is it's almost like a non-genre. We don't know what the norm is. You know, what does it, how does it look like? So it can be all the way from very personal and linear and narrative to all the way highly referenced and objective. So there are professors who write literacy narratives, right? And they've been published. You know, if you look at college composition and communication or college English, there are literacy narratives of, like, you know, somebody's dissertation. You know, Maurice Young, who is teaching at Madison, his dissertation in Ann Arbor is a complete literacy narrative about how he became a multilingual, multicultural person in Hawaii, becoming literate. So, but what I did was I left it open because I also wanted this genre to be negotiated. But I gave them a lot of examples. So I said, in the assignment sheet, I introduced it as there are many renditions possible for this genre, all the way from something that's personal and linear to something that is a montage, you know, that shapes the time structure and much more academics. And I did get a lot of different, I do still get a lot of different renditions. Some don't have a personal voice strongly, and the others have a lot more. So what I thought was, it's to the students to find their own genre. I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, in the sense that might be better to give them clear expectations. But what I also did was give them examples of literacy narratives to see how people accomplish this. So like this literacy narrative from Ulla Connor is something that I told them you can look for it as an example. So the answer is I kept it a little open, though I gave them examples and told them it can be realized differently, because I thought that has to be negotiated. It has to come through the course. And also, it also depends on the comfort level of the student.
Great, thanks.
One thing I must say to explain why I was so stuck on grammar, I think at that time, I still thought the final product has to come closer to academic norms, meaning should have standard English or edited American English, and should be much more carefully crafted. So I would rethink that bias, but I gave that in the expectations for the course. You know, you can develop it, but when you submit, make sure that you get help to edit it and be careful with your final product. So that was an expectation that was there.
So another related question was, well, how would you change this assignment if you were to teach it again? And many of us in our program and elsewhere are interested in teaching a literacy narrative. I often call it an autoethnography, but how would you imagine this?
Yeah, great question, great question. So what I think, and you guys can help me out here with other possibilities. I think the pedagogy was not the problem. I was the problem. That is, because the pedagogy was very flexible, right? It's dialogical, it's ecological, it's not teacher-led in the sense that it's open for a lot of interactions between students, conversations between students and teachers. So I would say the pedagogy is a safe pedagogy in the sense of giving options for students to work around, get multiple feedback, multiple drafts. But it's the teacher's dispositions that was the problem. And then I guess it's not a small thing, it's a big thing. Whatever pedagogy you have, it's eventually you who's going to give a grade. So I guess the idealistic answer is to say we have to rethink education in general about grading practices to begin with. Is giving one final grade at the end of the course sufficient? Should there be something different about grading? And I know we've been talking about that for centuries, I guess. So and there's no easy way out. So I would say the pedagogy was structured in a flexible way. Of course, there are other things people might do differently. I haven't done anything different, except that I'm trying to change myself about my expectations. That is, given all these different resources and ecologies and interactions, how do I now finally judge the essay? Am I prepared to get different renditions of the final draft? Am I prepared to get different literacy narratives that come in different forms? So that's my thinking at this point.
So I think we have one final question for you. And the question is from, I'm going to pronounce this correctly as much as I can, Shirley Macmillan. And the question is, given the back and forth between seeing Kyoko as passive and self-deprecating versus agentive and somewhat resistant, what role did grading play, or should it play? It seemed to be on your mind at one point. The person asks, if every interaction with students changes you, how has this changed your grading practice? So you definitely address this, but how does this help you think about assessment?
Yeah, I guess that's a big part of the change that is required. So I give the benefit of the doubt to the students in my current practices. That is, it's an easy thing for all of us to do, which is to do, I have something from maybe A and A minus, especially it's a graduate course, or maybe at the worst, a B plus if I don't see. So I work with a smaller range, I might say, that doesn't affect the student too much because I think differently about their accomplishment. But it's a tough thing because in my university, and I'm sure for a lot of you in your universities, the administration looks down on you if you have easy grades. If you give all A's, it's a problem. So I'm trying to work around that in a sense. And also I think it's unfair to students in a sense if you give A's to everybody. So I'm trying to work with a narrower upper level range of grades. I've given more importance to the portfolio now and less importance to the final product. But at that time, that was like the capstone project for me, capstone assignment. I did have the portfolio then, but it didn't count for a lot. So now I have reduced the percentage of points for the literacy narrative because that's just one part of it. I'm giving a lot more points for the portfolio. And one simple other change that I could have done is grade the person for the progress they are making rather than the final product. You know what I'm saying is that is, don't look at the end point of the trajectory, look at the trajectory itself, what's going on. So those are some changes I'm making in the way I'm looking at writing assessment.
So I think we have a few more minutes, Nicole, for maybe another question. So this is a follow-up question from one of our attendees. And the question is, she appreciates that you made yourself vulnerable and you're sharing this experience with all of us. What do you think prevented you from deploying cultural awareness? That's one part of the question. And the second part is you've written a lot about translingualism, and we know you as being one of the preeminent writers in that area. And yet you seem to have focused more on Kyoto's grammatical errors. How do you reconcile your knowledge of translingualism and this particular experience?
Right. So that's what I hinted at in the end, that hybridity, translingualism are good words, but how do you, what do you really mean by it? In the sense, hybridity to what level? Translingualism to what degree? In what form does hybridity or translingualism manifest itself? So just to reiterate that point, this is partly to answer the first part of the question also, why did I act differently then? I am changing in a lot of ways, and this is really literally true in the sense, through experiences like this with students, I am becoming radicalized. Where is JF? Come back, I'm getting radicalized. Yeah, JF earlier who bombed the meeting didn't like apparently radical people. So, but the funny thing is it's happening in the hands of students. So what happened was, I'm lately written about it. When I started with multilingualism, hybridity, translingualism, I thought still the reference point or framework is academic norms. That is, you have to get close to the academic norms. Just like the metaphor that Kyoko used, I said, there's a game the academic plays. It has certain rules. You can't break the rules completely and say, I'm still writing an academic essay. The academy would say, no, that's not the game you are playing here. You know, take that to your school magazine or use this as your private journal. You know, this is not an academic essay. So, so my position even then, some of the early writings has been that your diversity has to be framed in relation to the dominant norms, except that I leaned more towards the dominant norms in that example about 6 years ago than I would do now. Partly the reason is not because I'm a better teacher, partly because also the field is changing. Pedagogy is changing, academic discourse is changing, partly also because we started talking about these things, you know, about, say, talking about how students are trying to come up with different renditions of the academic essay, and why not give some space to it, is heard. You know, there are the teachers and administrators also probably listening. So what I would say is, I'm still translingual. I still believe in hybridized writing, except that I have shifted to closer to the other end of the continuum. You can think about this as a continuum. So here's Japanese discourse, here is American academic norms. I was closer to here, to the American academic norms then. I still am very pragmatic, and that's my sin. That is, and partly because for the sake of the second language students like me, in the sense, I don't want to make them failures because I'm radical. I want them to understand there are norms. I still believe there are norms, except that they are open, a lot more open to negotiation than I thought then. So I'm pragmatic in the sense that I want to not mislead the students by saying you can do anything you want. There are some clear expectations. But at that time, I was much closer to academic norms in my, at least the final expectations for a course. But now I'd be a lot closer to where students come from, but still not completely abandon any norms. You know, going back to the metaphor of the game, this has some norms. You know, this is a game, whether we like it or not. You know, this is not a place, I mean, I'm talking about academic writing. This is not a place where you can do anything. Depends on the genre. Now, partly literacy narrative is, again, a very flexible genre. So you can do a lot more things than sending something to an academic journal. So short answer, my idea of translingualism and hybridity and multilingualism is changing. If it is a paradox, so be it. I still hold to the same ideological position about diversity in writing, but the degree to which diversity can be accommodated has changed, partly because of the lessons I learned, but partly also because the field is changing.
Thank you, Suresh. I think that reminds us all of this notion of borders as being porous. things go in, things come out, things change, there's flux and flexibility. I also wanted to end by noting a phrase that you used earlier that Kyoko wrote, that she was in the middle of nowhere. And maybe what we're learning from you today through this conversation is that that students do end up in the middle of somewhere. And it is, I think, our role to guide them to that somewhere, wherever they are.
I think an even better metaphor is from the end, I'm in the middle of a shifting process. I think as teachers, all of us are. And I think we have to give a good grade for students who say that, right? In a sense, it's a positive statement. I'm in the middle of a shifting process. But yeah, that's true. That's a great metaphor. Thank you, Geeta.
Thank you so much, Suresh. This was such a pleasure. Thank you, everybody. We can't hear all the applause from our attendees. We can see them clapping. It's such a pleasure to have you, Suresh. So hang in there, stay with us, everybody. We probably have a few minutes before we go into our first panel, which will begin shortly. Thank you again.